Okay, so I'm Louise Bell. I am final year PhD student at the University of Leeds in the National Archives, and I look at limbless ex-servicemen in the two world wars, broadly is the sort of project, but a lot of that's looking at the prostheses themselves, what the men actually experienced, their lived experience. That's really important to get their voices in there, and that's a big part of that versus the state sort of narrative of what was happening in the two wars. How do you actually search in the catalogue is always a big thing. I mean, every catalogue's different for archives. You've got to use different terminology from the times potentially. Like, I'm not going to just put in prosthetic limbs and assume I'm getting the answer. Like, they didn't really call them prosthetic limbs in the First, Second World Wars. It was artificial limbs. You think of World Wars, you think of, I guess, War Office would be the obvious sort of collection to start in because it's the War Office. And there is actually a lot of stuff in the War Office once you actually kind of look at limbless ex-servicemen in the two world wars, but a lot of it is pretty boring, I'm not going to lie. So that's where the sort of more fun collections come in that you might not think about. There's a lot of stuff in sort of Ministry of Munitions because they were obviously helping create the prostheses, like my favourite document here. A lot of sort of health records, pension files in particular for the First World War, PIN 26 files have been incredible for actually searching through there and finding the men's voices. That's kind of the easiest way from the National Archives to actually find the men's voices is through their medical records because they're writing a lot of letters. There's a lot of letters written on their behalf. A lot of good stuff on sort of National Archives websites to kind of point you in the right direction of like what sort of series you want to look at and stuff like that. Because like I said, you wouldn't be thinking of Ministry of Munitions and you think of sort of typically more boring stuff like War Office. But yeah, once you kind of get an idea of what there is, you can start to use those search terms and that terminology to find other stuff as well in different record series, which is actually really useful. So starting somewhere basic like War Office does actually help because you know what they're saying at the time and what they're for. Probably it's catalogued like or named like on the catalogue. Well, I've got some blueprints of prostheses in the collections. They're in the Ministry of Munitions files. And it's just, I spent so much time reading about how they made prostheses, what materials they were using, the sort of engineering behind it. And like, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a mathematician, I don't understand any of that stuff realistically. So actually getting to see blueprints of them is so useful to get an idea of where that material is being used, what it was designed to look like. And I don't think you can actually look at something like this sort of part of disability history without actually looking at the objects in some way. I mean, written documents are great and there's loads of them here and there's so much information, but having actual pictorial evidence alongside it is completely like game changing because you can actually see it. I know that sounds stupid, but you can actually see it. There's a letter in the collections that I found very early on, and it's in Ministry of Labour, which isn't necessarily where I would think about looking for this stuff either. And it's from a really angry Scottish man in the First World War. And he loses both of his legs, and he's just desperate to actually get some decent employment and the sort of employment that he thinks that he's owed from the state, which I mean technically he is. And it was just it's such a powerful voice to have, and this man advocating for himself. And obviously I love that he's Scottish. And yeah, it's incredible to be able to have that sort of story of his life and what happened to him after he lost his limbs and actually have his voice. It's one of my favourites. I talk about it all the time. I think people are probably sick of me talking about it. So much here. As I've kind of said before, think about your search terms. Think about the terminology that might have been used at the time. I know that's not always easy, so maybe try and find a first document. I mean, I'm trying to look up prostheses or prosthetics or some sort of variation on that in the catalogue, and I mean, that's quite a difficult word to spell even for me at this point sometimes, so you can see why there might be mistakes with that in the catalogue. So doing things like wildcard searches and that are really, really useful. But yeah, be able to have a play around with terminology. Don't expect to go and just put in artificial limb and get your answer, for example, for me. Like, that's very rarely happening. Obviously I've got limb loss, limbless, limb, like arm, leg. Like, I've had to play around with so many search terms to try and find things. So it's a bit of perseverance a lot of the time as well, but that's kind of the fun part. So then you order stuff up, it might be useful, it might be not. So I think, yeah, don't give up. But you might just have to kind of think through that process of how you're actually going to get to these documents potentially.